For the artists, for the passionate. Welcome to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast, or welcome if it's your first time. I am your host Jade Black and I am here to talk about the Full House again, specifically the grand suit of the Full House. So a little quick recap from the introductory episode to the Full House is the grand suit pertains strictly to length and formats. It's not about genre as with the other suits. Hence POV, none of that applies. It's just about length and format. So let's talk about exactly what is contained in the grand suit. What are these different length categories and how do I define them? Because there's always some debate around this, particularly around shorter categories. So as soon as you get into what is microfiction, some people have very different definitions to that. And if you're a real stickler for your definition, by all means, use that instead. This is my personal clarification for me. And that's basically the entirety of the Full House, is that this works by the rules of my brain, and it will probably only make a limited amount of sense to other people. I'm very aware of that. But without further ado, there are 7 main types of cards in the grand suit. The one you'll notice being absent that I did mention in the last episode is short story collection. That's sort of an unofficial grand suit card, as is, because it's a lot more vague than anything else that's here. So in order, we have microfiction, we have flash fiction, we have short stories, we have novelettes, we have novellas, novels, and then macro fiction. In order to explain what these mean, the only real way to define these cleanly, clearly, and concisely is in word count. So if you are unfamiliar with page count versus word count, strap in, I guess. Microfiction, I personally have a hard limit on of 100 words. If it's 100 words or under, less than or equal to 100 words, I class that as microfiction. Some people stretch that to 200, but I do not. I'm quite strict on this one. Microfiction is where I started out, so technically speaking I do have an entire ream of microfiction cards, but I'm not really strictly counting anything from my earliest writing days, because a lot of that's just been lost over time, honestly. But also I've grown so much as a writer since then that I only really want to count microfiction that I can truly point to and say, yeah, I'm actually proud of this now, there is nothing I would change. And that's the same with flash and shorts as well. Moving on, talking of flash, my word count band for flash fiction, and this will be controversial for some people, is 300 to 800 words. That's just where I've always felt flash sits once you get longer than 800 words. I mean, calling 800 words a flash is a little bit tenuous to me anyway. If I wanted to be completely set, I would say 600, 300 to 600. But sometimes things just spill over a tiny bit, so there's a little bit of grace in there. And much like with microfiction, old cards, in theory, even though I would have, again, an entire ream of them, don't really apply anymore. Although that said, I do technically have one. I do technically have a 640 odd word flash. So I do technically have a flashcard as it stands. Short story, however, I'm not convinced I've ever really had a card for. I had one, but it was not very good, and that was a long time ago. Short story, I am classing as 1,000 words to 10,000 words. Because I just think that's neat, that's tidy, and it doesn't blur any boundaries really too much. Some people try and claim that 1,500 words is a flash, but I just fundamentally disagree with that. Once you get to 1,000 words, that is a short story, in my books. But yeah, as it stands, I don't have any short story cards, because I generally, even when I started out in Flash and Micro, it was really rare, really, really, really rare for me to get above 800 words in a first draft. And anything that did end up that long got cut down. So I genuinely think I've only ever written, technically speaking, one short story in my life that actually counts for anything, wasn't like when I was 3 or something. But it was not great, so I'm just not counting it anyway, and it was also like a very long time ago at this point. Novelette is a term that has a very loose definition just all round. I can't find any consistent answer as to how long a novelette should or shouldn't be, which is, I think, basically because people sort of forget it exists as a separate category to short story, which is kind of fair enough, to be honest. I've seen bottom-end estimates as low as 7k, and top-end estimates as high as 30k. I've sort of split the middle with this in a way that I just feel is fairly natural, and I've called this 10k to 20k. I did consider extending this to 25, but that's just kind of an awkward length. So novelette to me is 10k to 20k, anywhere in that band. So as it stands, Charcoal Rain and Count the Stars are basically slap bang in the middle of that as 15 and 14 respectively. 20k just seems like a nice upper limit, 10k round tidy lower limit. The line between short and novelette is blurry, so it made sense to put them at what is essentially the same mark. I've mentioned Count the Stars and Charcoal Rain already. Those are published novelette cards. I have others. Novelette is one of my favourite lengths to work with, because it's long enough to experiment and learn edits in very similar ways to long form, though not quite, in new genres, so it's just a really good length to learn with, and it scratches enough of the short fiction itch as well. Don't get me wrong, nothing, absolutely nothing, and I mean nothing, not even Flash, comes anywhere close to the sort of process and feel of writing microfiction. That is such a unique beast. But, the line between short stories and novelettes are pretty blurry to begin with, so it scratches enough of an itch for the most part. Now, novella is another category that gets very, very, very blurry, especially on social media. And again, because novelette sort of is somewhat of a phantom length, you can see low-end estimates, low-end categorization for novellas at like 17k, and high-end estimates for novellas, and I really wish I was making this up, have hit 65k, and honestly, that's just dumb that it would go that high, because that's literally just novel length at that point, but this is, people who only read 800-page books. Novellas are very hard to categorize, because some people try and say the band is really narrow and it's like literally 45 to 50k. I've seen that before. And the line between novelette and novella is quite hard to draw as well. But I feel fairly satisfied with calling a novella 35 to 50k. That's where I feel is about right. because 50k means there's enough of a gap to novel length, and there's also enough of a gap on the other end to novelette. I'm aware a 35k novella would be a very short novella, but it's a very short novella in the same way that 10k would be a very short novelette. Like, it's sort of technically correct, but it wouldn't be somewhere I'd necessarily be comfortable sitting. Comfortably, I would probably say 40k to 50k, but I think it's reasonable. I think it's good practice, as much as anything, to give a little bit of grace on these things within reason. Novella, I really love reading novellas, but they feel very unnatural to concept to me. I sort of have an idea of how much story a novelette needs, and a pretty good idea of how much story a novel needs, but trying to split that down the middle is not very easy. But though I'm going to talk about that more later. Novels. This is another really hot potato, and it's very genre dependent, but I don't really have that much inclination to write novels that are outside of the thriller suit, which, for those of you that haven't watched the introductory episode, is just novels that aren't thrillers. I don't have that much inclination to do that. I do have some plans outside, but I'll be talking about that more later. So in that regard, I've left my novel band in a place that some people will very much disagree with, at 65 to 85k. So 65, I think, is reasonable. I technically class minimum novel length that I'm comfortable with at 70, but a little bit shorter I think is fine, but only a little bit. And you know, as the word counts get higher, the leeway is sort of exponential, so you know, having 5k leeway at the bottom end of novella is different to 5k leeway at the bottom end of a novel. That's a very different thing. 85k at a top, honestly I considered having that lower at 80, because if you're starting to nudge past 80 at thriller, there's a chance you're just doing something wrong and you're actually just writing noir instead, to be honest. But some subgenres of thriller are just naturally longer, so political thriller is the obvious one, legal thriller is the second most obvious one there. But if you're going above 85, you're going to have a very, very good reason for doing it, and honestly, I'm just not a fan, personally. I know some people class novels up to 100k, and again, in some genres, I think maybe that's reasonable. But honestly, going past 90, I think, with any genre, you got to have a really good reason for doing that. But there is a category beyond novel, and that is macrofiction, because there's not really an official category beyond novel. You get, you know, epic novel or, you know, chonk, but I don't really like those as terms. They don't, you know, on the one hand feel very ingenuous or very official. So I've dubbed that macrofiction, just as the opposite of microfiction. It just kind of makes sense. And I've dubbed this 120k plus, because it needs to be significantly more than a standard length book at 70-75, but it doesn't need to be, you know, necessarily double the length at 150. I think having, you know, sort of 60% plus on top makes sense. I mean, if you're talking about, if you split the difference in my band, you end up at 73, give or take. So 120k with 73, you're talking about like an extra 60% on top. I think it's reasonable at that point to just put that in an entirely separate category. I just sort of naturally do. You could also make an argument for anything sort of above 200, but again, I mean, trying to write anything that's 120k that's one thing. Going above 200, again, you are going to have to give me a dissertation on why you've done that for me to believe it's necessary, and you can't just split the book in half somewhere and just make it 2. This is always the thing I struggle with really long books. If you've got 120k or so, just split that into 260s. But that's maybe a me thing, that's maybe a genre thing, coming from thriller and horror, where you just don't do that because you're doing something wrong if you do that, really. Macrofiction is a card that exists basically because it can. It's not something that I'm that bothered about actually doing. It's just there for the sake of being comprehensive, really. It's a category that, really, this is a grand suit Joker, if anything, but it's there. Now, if you've been paying close attention, or just looking at the screen, with these word count brackets, you will notice there are 3 areas of no man's land in there. And the first is the novella gap, which is 20k to 35k. And yeah, this one's tricky. I'm not really sure what to do with that band. Because if it's 25 or so, then to be honest, at that point I'll just say, well, you just cut 5k out of that and make it a tighter novelette, and it's probably better for it. If you're looking at 30k, you could extend that into a novella, and that's probably the right move, but it's quite hard to know. It ends up at a very weird length. It doesn't really fit neatly anywhere. I don't think I'm going to come across that, but we will see in time, I guess. And I'll deal with that when I get there, and there'll probably be an episode about it, but honestly I'm not anticipating that being a major issue, because chances are it just gets cut down into a tight novelette and it's better for it. The second no man's land, and this one is quite conspicuous, is 50k to 65k, which is the novella novel gap. And again, this one's tricky, but less so. Because again, if you're not that far above 50k, maybe that's just fine for a novella, for one. But also you can just cut it down, make it a bit tighter, it's probably better for it. And if you're at the high end, you just write a bit more and make it into a proper full-length novel. I have had to do that so many times, honestly. I've had to do that with, half of the Determined One books that I've written. Black Executioner, very notably. And I will have to do it again. I will. I'm an underwriter. This is something that's very common for me. And in terms of actually hitting this gap on anything that's not a novel, that's so unlikely to happen. Genuinely is. Novels might end up in here if I've underwritten them. I wouldn't be surprised if Beneath the Moon ended up there. Novellas are almost definitely not going to end up that long. My novellas, I anticipate being short. The other very conspicuous no man's land is 85 to 120k, which many people would just class as novel anywhere in that. And up to 100k, depending on genre, very big asterisk there, I would let that go, actually. Once you get to 100k to 120, that's actually where it gets more awkward. This is the most unlikely no man's land I'll ever hit. If it ever goes beyond that, which has happened once with Miss Nakagami, the first draft of that was 110 and it was ridiculous. But, it's ended up at 78 for a reason. I talked about that in the 1 month on episode in a fair bit of detail. And again, it would be a very similar process to that. It would just be, we'll cut it down, make it tighter, it'll be better for it. I can't see myself writing a 100k novel and thinking that's the correct length. In time, I might be proving myself wrong. I'm never going to say never. But I do think it's obscenely unlikely. So, as with all these suit episodes and trick episodes as well, let's move on to projects that align with different cards. So, micro, flash, and shorts, the unheard ones is where all of that lives. The unheard ones does sort of get the semi-joker in short story collection as well. That's the whole idea of the unheard ones, is that's what it is. And it's going to probably primarily be short stories, but I've got a couple of flashes that I want to include, and I'd just really like a micro or two in there because I love microfiction with my whole heart. I absolutely adore microfiction. So I think that would be really neat. The full idea and concept of the unheard ones, however, is not something I want to talk about yet, because that is a very long way off. It has been very fluid. It's something that's been invented and reinvented more than a few times. In terms of suit it would fit into, the 4 main suits that is, it probably sits nicely in the grit suit, though it might end up in quill. Now, novelettes. This is a huge slew of cards for me. I've already mentioned Count the Stars and Charcoal Rain in 2 Shadowspark anthologies, Cozy-ish and Dreamcore respectively, but I just write novelettes on the side of my novels all the time because it's good to keep things fresh, much as anything, sort of one day on, one day off with main project and then novella. I've talked about this in quite a lot of detail in the 1 month on episode again. It just works, keeps things fresh, allows me to experiment, gives things time to marinate, all of these things. It's a good length. It's sort of long but not too long, and short but not too short. It just works really, really nicely. So I have a whole slew of novelettes that, finished to varying degrees. So Count the Stars and Charcoal Rain are just full on polished and published. The Night Theatre is actually in 1.1 draft and could do with a bit more meat. City of Tiny Lights is in first draft. Hypoxemia, as of recording this, is the one I'm currently working on. By the time this episode goes out, it might be complete. I don't know when this episode is going to go out, so who knows. Whatever my current one is, you'll be able to find out pretty easily. In terms of novels, this kind of goes without saying. The Determined Ones is basically the entirety of that for the moment. There are going to be 8 of those. I am currently writing the 5th one of those, which will actually be the 4th release, which is, a little bit confusing, but there's going to be a whole episode about that too. It might already be up, who knows. But there are also other novels I have planned beyond the Determined Ones. There are 3 other extended projects around that, and also Amber Eyes as well, which is a placeholder name for what it's worth. But yeah, I got a lot of plans for novels in my time, like a lot of plans. Not every compendium I'm planning is the same length. Not every one is 8 books. There is one that is concepted as it stands to be longer, but we'll see. And there is one that is concepted as it stands to be shorter. But again, we will see. Novella, I don't have a concept for. As alluded to earlier, I just don't know how much story you need for a novella. Again, because it's a sort of weirdly broad but also narrow bracket, it's quite difficult, because a 35k story, in terms of just how much story there is, how much content there is, how many words that is a very different beast to a 50k story. It's only 15k difference, which isn't that much once you get to novel length, necessarily. But when it's shorter, if you take a novella being 35k, that's, the best part of an extra 50% on top. So I'm just not really sure how to go about that. I'd really like to have a novella under my belt because I love reading novellas. I think they're really, really cool. A lot of my favourite reads this year have been novellas, if not almost all of my favourite reads this year. I also don't know how that would work as a sort of one-on, one-off side project, because part of the idea with writing novelettes as a side project is it's not too much to keep in my head, because novels take up so much space. And I'm sort of conscious that novellas will take up a decent amount more space than a novelette. What I'm hoping happens is that one of the novelette concepts I have gets out of control, and it just ends up being longer and ends up growing into a novella, because, I mean, how many times have I had projects go out of control and end up longer than they should have done, and that's not even just Miss Nakagami, that's just so many things at this point. So that will probably happen at some point. That's my main sort of plan for novellas. That's something I might revisit in time. So again, macrofiction is another one I just don't have a particular concept for at all. I don't really care for macrofiction. I've already talked about that. If you've got a book that's 120k, just split it into two. Make it a duology. Just stop. But I do technically have a concept for this, but I really just don't know whether this will ever, be published or exist properly or anything, or really just how it interacts with anything else I've ever done. And I might do a full, episode on this at some point, but this is the Traveller's one. And you can probably tell by the convention there that this is related to the Determined ones. This is sort of a world-building guide, you might see it as somewhat of a series bible for a TV show. Sort of like that. That's the sort of basic idea. It's the sort of world-building thing that's dressed up as a travel guide to make it a bit more interesting and less like reading someone's PhD thesis. But this is something that has been reinvented so many times already, and I don't know really whether it's something that will ever be fully complete just because of that. I don't know whether I'll ever have a fully solid concept for everything I want in there and not feel like things are missing, and I don't know whether it will even be all that long. It's not something I have hard release plans or hard release date for, even in the same way as the Unheard ones, where I do actually have a fluid target release date for that. The Traveller's one, I just don't have that at all. It's not going to be coming, any point within the next 10 years, and I do mean that, because it's not something that you can just sort of do. I could just sort of do right now, because there needs to be enough existing material for that not to just be distasteful, almost. Like, that's... I don't know whether it'll ever be released. It's one of those things I occasionally dabble in every now and then when I just want to sort of brain dump a bit, or just... I want to write, but not on anything else. Sometimes I'll sort of dabble with that a bit. And eventually it might reach a sort of completed draft stage, and that's really the only point at which I would ever actually fully consider doing anything much with it. So there you have it, your full overview of the Grand Suit and plans I have for it, what it really is, and all of that. If you haven't watched the introductory episode to the Full House, This may or may not have made an amount of sense to you. In any case, I highly recommend you do go back and watch that if you haven't yet. But if you're interested in my published Grand Suit cards, there are 3 of those. There is a novel card, that is Mr. Nakagami, that is my debut, the first in the Determined ones, that is Haru's story. There is also Count the Stars, a related novelette in Shadowspark's cozy-ish anthology. And Charcoal Rain, which is unrelated in Shadowspark's Dream Court anthology. Links to all of that in the description. In the description you will also find links to my social media platforms, which I am on to varying different degrees. If you are a fan of the podcast, you want to know what the episode of the week is in advance, whether it's to do with the full house or not, if you've been enjoying this, Instagram is the place to be. I'm Jade_Black21 on there. I don't really know what I'm doing, so you'll get random stuff on there too, which is very much the vibe of the podcast, so that's fun. If you are interested in what my current side project is, because there's a good chance it's not hypoxemia anymore, and you want semi-live updates, I do writing updates just about every morning, and or to join in on the monthly Thrills prompt, which I host. Twitter is the place to be. I am JBlack21 on there. The place I'm probably second most active is actually Pinterest. This is my art place. You'll find tons of art about Mr. Nakagami and a whole bank of snippets for Mr. Nakagami. Some of that stuff is exclusive to Pinterest, there's a whole load of world building stuff on there, so you can see what the places I write about sort of look like, and some other things too. So if that's interesting to you, I'm Jade_Black21 on there. And I do also technically exist on Blue Sky. I'm never there. I don't really make time for game dev, at least not at the minute, so yeah, but you could follow me on there if you so choose. I'm JadeBlack21. But if you have any of these Grand Suit cards published, and I do mean any, or they're well on the way, please do get in touch. I'd love to be a part of your journey. I'd be happy to talk about anything you've got here, even macrofiction. I'd actually be really interested to talk to someone who's done that and why they've done it, and I think that would be really interesting, actually. So you can get in touch via email. I'm jade42black@gmail.com. Please check the list in the description, include all that information. It just streamlines everything and makes things a lot easier. Indie and self-pub, you are the people I want to hear from the most. Trad pub, I will consider you. From now on, I am prioritising dark lit, because there are so few spaces for indie dark lit, and for what it is worth, that does not include dark fantasy. But until next time, you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a like, or commenting, or subscribing. It really does help the channel a lot. All music is done by me. Copyright Jade Black 2025.